Ethan Miller had already shut down his laptop when his phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside the window. Lucas was working late again, which had become normal enough that Ethan barely questioned it anymore. He glanced at the screen, expecting a delivery notification or a message from work scheduled for the next morning. Instead, he saw the name Daniel Wright. Daniel was his boss, calm, precise, respected by everyone in the office. He was also not the kind of man who called employees after hours. Ethan hesitated before answering. His thumb hovered, his mind filling the pause with assumptions he didn't want to name. When he finally picked up, Daniel's voice came through steady and familiar, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Ethan, I hope I'm not calling too late," Daniel said. "No, it's fine," Ethan replied, straightening instinctively, even though Daniel couldn't see him. "Everything okay?" There was a brief silence, not awkward but deliberate. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Daniel said. "Not work-related. Would you be willing to come by my place tonight?" The request landed heavier than Ethan expected. Daniel's home was not a topic that ever came up. Work stayed at work. Boundaries were clean. Or at least, they had been. Ethan looked around the apartment, at the half-folded laundry and the mug Lucas had left on the table that morning. "Tonight?" he asked. "If that's all right," Daniel said. "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." Ethan told himself there was nothing wrong with the conversation. Daniel had always been fair to him, even encouraging, noticing details others overlooked. Still, something about the invitation stirred a quiet tension under Ethan's ribs. "I can come," he said, before he fully examined why. The drive across town felt longer than usual. The city lights blurred against the windshield as Ethan replayed the past few months in his head. Daniel's lingering looks during meetings. The way his voice softened when he said Ethan's name. None of it had crossed a line, nothing tangible, nothing that could be called out, but Ethan had felt it all the same. Daniel's house stood at the end of a quiet street, modern and understated. When Daniel opened the door, he smiled in a way that was more personal than professional, and Ethan felt that subtle shift again, like stepping onto unfamiliar ground. "Thanks for coming," Daniel said, stepping aside to let him in. The house smelled faintly of coffee and cedar. The living room was neat, almost too controlled, as if no one lived there long enough to leave a mess. Daniel gestured toward the couch, but instead of sitting, he moved toward the back of the house. "Let's talk somewhere quieter," he said. Ethan followed, aware of the sound of his own footsteps. The hallway narrowed, and the warmth of the living room gave way to something more enclosed. Daniel opened the door to a smaller room, an office, maybe, lit by a single lamp. The space felt deliberately private. As the door closed behind them, Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle. This wasn't casual. This wasn't nothing. Daniel didn't speak right away. He leaned against the desk, watching Ethan with an expression that held restraint and something close to hesitation. "I asked you here because I trust you," he said finally. "And because I don't have many places where I can be honest." Ethan swallowed. Trust was a dangerous word. It implied responsibility, intimacy, and expectation. "About what?" he asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "About feeling like I've been living parts of my life in separate rooms," he said. "And wondering what happens when those rooms start to overlap." The words settled between them, deliberate and unfinished. Ethan thought of Lucas, of the comfort they shared and the distance that had grown quietly between them. He thought of work, of admiration turning into something harder to define. Daniel met his eyes. "I needed you to hear this from me," he said. Ethan didn't move toward the door. He didn't step closer either. He stayed exactly where he was, suspended between the life he knew and the one that had just been suggested. The silence stretched, not empty but charged, and Ethan realized that simply staying in that room was already a choice. The silence in the room did not break on its own. It thickened, settling into the corners like dust no one dared disturb. Ethan remained standing, his hands loose at his sides, while Daniel straightened from the desk and moved with measured calm toward the window. He did not touch Ethan, did not even come close enough to invade his space, yet the distance between them felt deliberate, almost careful. "I should explain myself," Daniel said, his back still turned. "Or at least try to." Ethan nodded, though Daniel couldn't see it. His chest felt tight, as if the room had grown smaller since the door closed. "You don't have to," he said, but the words lacked conviction. Daniel turned then, leaning lightly against the window frame. The lamplight cut sharp lines across his face, revealing something Ethan had never seen at the office: fatigue, maybe, or honesty unfiltered by authority. I do, Daniel replied. Because I brought you here knowing it would complicate things. That admission landed harder than Ethan expected. It confirmed what he had tried to dismiss on the drive over, that this meeting was not accidental, not impulsive. It had been considered. Daniel continued, his voice steady but quieter now. I've spent most of my life managing impressions. At work, in relationships, even with myself. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. You get good at it after a while. You learn which parts of you are acceptable and which ones are easier to keep hidden. Ethan listened without interrupting. He had always been good at that, absorbing, understanding. Maybe that was why Daniel trusted him now. Or maybe that was why this felt dangerous. When you started working for me, Daniel said, I noticed how observant you were. How you listened. You don't rush people. You let them finish their thoughts. A faint, restrained smile crossed his face. That's rare. Ethan felt a flicker of warmth, followed quickly by guilt. Praise from a boss was one thing. Praise like this, personal, intimate, was something else entirely. I just do my job, he said. Daniel shook his head. You do more than that. And somewhere along the way, I realized I looked forward to our conversations more than I should. The words settled between them, unadorned and honest. Ethan's mind immediately went to Lucas, to evenings spent side by side on the couch, to shared routines that had begun to feel more like habits than choices. He told himself that attraction was not betrayal, that thoughts alone did not undo commitment. Still, his pulse quickened. I never meant to cross a line, Daniel said. But lines don't always announce themselves when you're approaching them. Sometimes you look back and realize you've already stepped over. Ethan shifted his weight, the carpet soft under his shoes. Then why ask me here? He asked. It was the question he had been circling since the phone call, the one he could no longer avoid. Daniel met his gaze directly. Because pretending nothing was happening felt dishonest. And because I needed to know if what I felt was one-sided. The room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan understood, suddenly, that this was not a moment for clever responses or careful deflection. Anything he said would matter. He thought of Lucas again, not in sharp detail, but as a presence, a reminder of the life waiting for him outside this house. He also thought of the version of himself standing here now, alert and seen in a way that made his chest ache. I don't know what I feel, Ethan said finally. It was the most truthful answer he had. I know I respect you. I know I think about our conversations after they end. And I know I didn't say no when you called. Daniel's expression softened, not with triumph but with recognition. That's enough, he said. I wasn't looking for certainty. Just honesty. They stood there, the admission hanging quietly between them. No music played. No clock ticked loudly enough to measure the moment. Ethan became acutely aware of the fact that nothing physical had happened, and yet something irreversible already had. Daniel moved then, not toward Ethan, but to the chair near the desk, sitting as if grounding himself. I want to be clear, he said. I'm not asking anything of you tonight. I needed to say this out loud. To you. After that, the choice is yours. Ethan felt an unexpected relief at that, paired with something more complicated. Choice sounded empowering, but it also carried responsibility. If he stayed, if he continued listening, if he didn't walk out now, the consequences would belong to him as much as to Daniel. And if I leave? Ethan asked. Daniel nodded once. Then I'll respect that. Tomorrow, at work, nothing changes unless you want it to. The answer was careful, practiced. It reminded Ethan that Daniel was used to control, to anticipating outcomes. That, too, should have been a warning. Ethan looked at the closed door. Leaving would be simple. Open it, step back into the hallway, return to the life he understood. Staying meant uncertainty, questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. He didn't move. Daniel watched him quietly, his expression unreadable. The distance between them remained, but the space felt charged now, full of unspoken possibilities. Ethan realized that whatever happened next would not be dramatic or loud. It would unfold in subtle decisions, in moments like this where silence spoke louder than action. I should go soon, Ethan said, though he made no effort to check the time. Of course, Daniel replied, but he didn't stand. They shared a look that held more meaning than either of them named. Ethan understood then that this room had already altered the shape of things. He had crossed an emotional threshold simply by staying long enough to listen. As he finally turned toward the door, his hand hovering just short of the handle, he knew the conversation was not finished. It had only been paused, waiting for the moment when neither of them would pretend that words alone were enough. Ethan did not leave immediately. His hand rested on the door handle longer than necessary, as if his body needed time to catch up with the decision his mind was still negotiating. Behind him, Daniel remained seated, giving him space that felt intentional, almost respectful. That restraint made everything harder. I didn't expect this to be easy, Ethan said quietly, still facing the door. I just didn't think it would feel this heavy. Daniel stood then, slowly, careful not to rush the moment. Some choices carry weight because they matter, he replied. Not because they're wrong. Not always. Ethan turned back to him. The distance between them had narrowed without either of them moving closer. He noticed details he had ignored before, the tension in Daniel's jaw, the controlled way he held himself, like someone accustomed to discipline but tired of enforcing it on his own emotions. You asked me to be honest, Ethan said. So I will be. Part of me wants to walk out and pretend this was just a conversation. And part of me knows that would be a lie. Daniel didn't interrupt. He listened the same way Ethan always had, fully, attentively. I care about someone, Ethan continued. Lucas's name remained unspoken, but present all the same. And I don't hate that life. I'm just not sure it's enough anymore. Daniel's expression shifted, not into relief, but into something more somber. I won't pretend that hearing that doesn't matter to me, he said. But I don't want to be an escape. I don't want to be a mistake you explain away later. The words landed with surprising gentleness. Ethan realized then that Daniel was just as exposed as he was, perhaps more so. Authority dissolved quickly in private rooms. I don't think this is about escape, Ethan said. I think it's about seeing something clearly for the first time. They stood there, close enough now to feel each other's presence without touching. Ethan became acutely aware of how still the room was, how the world outside seemed distant and irrelevant. Nothing dramatic happened, no sudden movement, just a shared understanding that the boundary they had been circling no longer felt theoretical. Daniel spoke first. If you want to leave, say the word, he said. I mean it. Ethan searched his face, looking for manipulation, for expectation. He found neither. What he saw instead was patience, and that unsettled him more than pressure ever could. I don't want to leave, Ethan said. The admission changed the air in the room. Daniel nodded once, as if accepting a truth rather than celebrating it. He took a step closer, slow enough that Ethan could have retreated if he wanted to. He didn't. What followed was quiet and unremarkable to an outside observer. No rush, no spectacle. Just the closing of space that had already been bridged emotionally long before. Ethan registered the warmth of proximity, the way anticipation softened into something steadier, more deliberate. Time moved strangely after that. When Ethan finally stepped back, the room felt altered, like it held a version of him that hadn't existed before tonight. He glanced at the clock on the wall and was surprised by how late it had become. I should go, he said again, this time meaning it. Daniel nodded. I know. They walked back through the hallway together. The house no longer felt unfamiliar, but it didn't feel like a place Ethan belonged either. At the door, they paused, facing each other in the neutral space between inside and out. Tomorrow, Ethan said, uncertain. At work, Daniel's voice returned to something more measured, though not distant. Tomorrow will be professional, he said. Unless you decide otherwise. Ethan appreciated that Daniel didn't promise things he couldn't control. All right, he said. Outside, the night air felt cooler than before. Ethan sat in his car for a moment without starting the engine. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened windshield, familiar and foreign at once. He thought of Lucas, waiting at home, unaware that something fundamental had shifted. He thought of Daniel, standing behind that door, carrying the same silence. The drive back was quieter than the one before. Ethan noticed the city again, the lights, the intersections, the ordinary world continuing uninterrupted. When he reached the apartment, Lucas was there, half asleep on the couch, offering a tired smile that carried years of shared history. Long night? Lucas asked. Yeah, Ethan said. It was true in every sense of the word. Later, lying awake beside Lucas, Ethan stared at the ceiling. Guilt surfaced, not sharp and immediate, but slow and insistent. He wondered when exactly the line had been crossed. Was it the call, the room, the moment he chose not to leave? Morning came too quickly. At work, Daniel greeted him with the same composed professionalism as always. No one else would have noticed the difference. But Ethan did, in the briefest glance, in the restraint that now carried memory. He understood then that this was not an ending. It was the beginning of something more complicated than desire, a quiet unraveling that would demand choices again and again. As Ethan sat at his desk, pretending to focus on emails, he realized that one closed door had already reshaped his life. And the hardest part wasn't what had happened inside that room. It was knowing that whatever came next would require him to decide who he was willing to become.